Dear listener, in these final festive days of the year, you may find yourself in a jubilant state of mind. And by all means, embrace it. Don your holiday sweaters, sing your cheery songs, and drink your peppermint mochachinos. But while you do, know this. The rituals surrounding the 25th of December harken back not to the birth of a certain prophetic carpenter, but to pagan customs as old as the forest itself. For long before Santa Claus came down any chimney, before Saint Nicholas of Myra was even born, it was Odin who soared through the sky on a winter's night, and Father Frost who brought gifts for the little ones. So when you sing carols door to door, bring a pine tree into your home, trade presents by candlelight, or lock lips below the mistletoe, you are not, in fact, honouring the god of sandy Judea, but the hallowed spirits of the black woodlands of ancient Europe. It was those pagan peasants with their pole gods and their runic lots that divined the secret of the season, that in the longest nights of the year, the curtain between life and death is at its most frail, and it is ever so easy for spirits to slip through. That is why they rejoiced when the sun arose on the 25th, for it was the first new light of a new year, and meant that darkness lay behind them. So let us now turn back the planets in their orbits and rewind the cosmic clock to a bygone age, and celebrate these darkest of days with a little story about young lovers and hungry gods. Frenna was 16, and a good wife. She sat now by the fire in the long house, her newborn suckling quietly at her left breast, her golden hair loose about her shoulders, and she hummed a wintry lullaby. The flames seemed to dance to the rhythm of her voice, with little arms in fiery motion, licking up the sides of the heavy, sacred log upon the hearth. 'Twas midday on the first full day of Yule, the festival celebrated across the 3 shortest days and darkest nights of the year, when families gathered indoors to feast and to sing, to honour their dead, and to wait for the third dawn, for the first light, for the new hope. Frenna's family was all gone, taken by sickness or by the arrows of the hillmen, but she had a new family now, and a new log house, built by her hands and the hands of her husband, Abelin. And they had a blessed child of their own, come but 3 weeks earlier, in the first hours of the holy month. Abelin came into the house now with snow on the shoulders of his cloak. "How now, my lovelies?" he said, hanging his axe by the door and his cloak on the nail. He leaned to kiss Frenna on her forehead, and then the baby in turn. "What news from the forest, husband?" asked Frenna. "It shall be a quiet Yule in the valley. No more trips to the village for us, until after the new year. The north road has snowed in and the river's frozen solid. But I hear traders may come through this afternoon. We've dried venison and berries to barter, if we wish." "Is that all thee know?" He knelt and kissed her lips, long and soft. "I know I love thee," he whispered. Frenna touched his cheek. "Sit with us, watch the log burn, watch the old pass away in ash and smoke. Let me get off my frozen boots first." Soon the young family was gathered together on the bench, the blanket draped across the shoulders of both parents, the baby asleep against its mother's chest. "See thee faces in the fire?" Abelin asked, after some time had passed. "Nay, why would I?" "Well, thee sees faces in the trees, all the time. Is it not so?" "That is different, husband. I've always felt a kinship with the spirits of the forest, of things green and growing. Fire is lovely, but I cannot sense the soul in it. Can thee?" "Nay, I have no blood of witches in my veins. Mayhaps our son shall have the gift." Frenna looked down at the infant, His tiny fist was drawn up against his chin, his mouth puckered, his cheek rosy in the firelight. "He has my bright eyes," she said, "but thy dark hair, a perfect mix then, half witch, half hunter. He shall do grand deeds in this world. That he shall." Traders did come, just before sunset, and called from the centre of the valley. Frenna wrapped the baby tightly upon her front in a woolen scarf, then clasped a cloak of rabbit pellets over her shoulders. Albelin helped her put on her boots, and carrying the burden of their wares upon his back, they all went out together, through the glade and into the trees. No wind blew, so snow fell in silent lines between the needled branches and gathered diamond bright upon the forest floor to be crunched under their feet.
"How now, young ones?"
called an old man, standing with an old woman, and a mule laden with goods beside the frozen river.
"Methinks we've not met. Blessed day, elders. We made this valley our home in the spring, coming from the west. I am Albelin, son of Emric. This is my bride, Frenna, daughter of Everhelm." "Everhelm,"
said the old man, his frosted eyebrows arching on his wrinkled forehead.
"Knew thee my father?"
asked Frenna.
"Only his reputation, lady. 'Twasn't fair what happened in thy lands."
"And what?" snapped the old woman, who looked far less jovial than her husband, though both were white of hair and spare of teeth.
"And what?"
she repeated.
"Is fairness in this life?"
She spat upon the snow.
"Ye must forgive my wife,"
said the old man.
"Her mind turns to gloom each holy season. With Yule now upon us, her spirit is low indeed. I am Gelfrat. Wulfhild my wife is called. Have thee goods to trade?"
As Albelin and Gelfrat set to talking, old Wulfhild approached the young mother, head cocked, milky eyes alight.
"Thee has little one under thy cloak."
"Aye," said Frenna guardedly.
"A boy child, not yet a month old. And might an old woman see this new life?"
Frenna opened her cloak and showed the infant.
"Precious,"
said Wulfhild, her voice very low and very sad.
"Have thee not children of thy own?"
Frenna asked.
"4 sons and 2 daughters, once upon a time. All dead now, long past. None live beyond their 2nd year." "Poor fortune, lady,"
said Frenna.
"'Twas more than that,"
whispered Wulfhild. She came closer, one shaking, wrinkled hand outstretched above the baby, a creeping terror in her eyes.
"Taken, all, on winter's nights, the event tides of Yule, like this one."
Frenna covered her son with the cloak. Wulfhild grimaced, blinked, and looked up into her face.
"Fear not the wild hunt, young one. Fear not the march of wanton and the beasts."
Frenna shrugged, wishing now she had stayed inside and left Albelin to trade alone.
"I've heard tales that a procession of spirits might be seen in the woods on the holy nights, though they've never bothered me before." "Not yet, thee means."
The old woman turned, gazing into the shadowy pines, bent and heavy with snow all around them.
"This valley is such a place as they would haunt, and ye young ones their perfect prey. For in the dark of winter, all the world is hungry, even the gods."
Having concluded their business, Albelin and Gelfrat broke apart. When he saw the worry on Frenna's face, Albelin stepped between her and the old woman.
"We must be off home now, before the sun sets,"
he said.
"Aye, as we must. Stay safe, new friends,"
called Gelfrat, guiding his mule away along the riverbank. As they started back across the snow to their longhouse, Frenna heard the old woman calling after them.
"Even the gods!"
'Twas custom on the supper of Yule to set a place for one's departed loved ones at the table, and to leave the dishes out for the souls to take their share, once the living had finished feasting. Frenna and Abelin didn't have much, but what they had, they shared with each other and with the dead. They had only 1 horn's worth of spiced wine, and when it came her turn to drink, Frenna held up the horn and drank to the memories of her family: father, mother, brother, sisters, nephews, and nieces. When it was her husband's turn, Abelin drank only to the memory of Zymaria, the grandmother who raised him and had died 2 summers back.
One day,
said Abelin, wiping his lips after finishing the wine, and smiling warmly as Frenna fed their baby his own feast at her nipple.
one day this house shall be thrice as long, with stables beside, and our children and their wives and husbands and our grandchildren shall fill the table. And then, Frenna, we shall sing merry songs and watch the log burn, all together. I promise thee.
I pray thee is right, said Frenna.
I would hate to end up like that Gelfrat and Wulfhild, old, childless and ill of spirit.
He was all right, said Albelin, dipping the crust of his bread into the vegetable soup and chewing loudly.
What did his wife say to thee?
Frenna winced. The baby had pinched her. She adjusted herself and sighed.
Oh, nothing of note, husband. Just the ramblings of a broken mind is all.
But as the night wore on, and a great wind rose up in the valley to rattle the door and shake the walls of the longhouse, Frenna could not help but remember the old woman's lined face, her fogged eyes, her words of warning. And as the family slept, Frenna pulled Abelin close to her, cradling the baby between them like a priceless treasure, clinging to those she loved. Abelin and the baby were still asleep the next dawn, when Frenna went out to check the traps and honour the pole god with a morning prayer. More snow had fallen during the night, and lay thick in banks that filled the valley. Frenna tightened snowshoes under her boots, and using a branch as a staff to steady herself, she made her way south from the house, through the glade, and past the empty garden. There, beside the path, stood the ancient pole god of her family. At the top of the wooden pole, the carved head was round and slit-eyed, with a heavy beard and jutting tongue. Below the head, its arms were short and thin, sticking out like wings. Its body was straight and narrow, carved with sacred runes of protection, and forked at the base to stand upright. Frenna knew not the age of the little god. She only knew it had been on her family's mountain for as long as anyone could remember. After what had happened, and Frenna had fled. Alone, she had brought the god pole with her, and when they came to this valley, Abelin had found a place to install it, where it could look over their homestead. The snow covered all her traps that morning, and it came up in a drift almost to the pole god's neck. Frenna stopped beside the pole, and using her hands, began to clear the snow from around it.
What god is this supposed to be?
Asked a clear voice from right beside her. Frenna gasped and spun around, her hand snatching the dagger from her belt and holding it up before her. A woman stood in the morning light. Frenna did not know her. In fact, she had never seen anything quite like this woman before. Her skin and hair and the flowing dress she wore were all white as snow. Her face was old, but smooth as polished stone, and her eyes were bluer than a clear sky and shimmered like jewels.
I say again, child,
the woman said, in a ringing voice like a silver bell.
What god is this upon thy pole?
Frenna did not dare to blink, but kept her dagger raised.
Who are thee?
Frenna asked.
His name first.
The woman raised a pale arm to point at the pole. Frenna swallowed, then shook her head.
He has no name, or none that is remembered. We call him the Old One. I see. Well then, they call me the bright one. And is that thy name? Pectar is my name, child. And thy name is...
The woman cocked her head, her white hair falling in a curtain over her shoulder, bright eyes seeming to stare right through her.
Frenna.
Frenna lowered the dagger a few inches.
Thee knows me. Now I do. And what are thee, Pectar? Are thee flesh or spirit?
The woman laughed.
All is spirit. Flesh is but one form it may choose to take, for a short while. But are thee like me? Are thee mortal?
Pectar shook her head.
Were thee once?
Pectar nodded.
And now?
Asked Frenna.
Are thee more than human, or less than?
Pectar smiled and nodded again. Frenna lowered the dagger, though her grip remained tight upon its hilt.
Why come thee to our valley, spirit? To scout, to seek, to find. To find what?
Pectar stepped toward Frenna, and though the woman wore no snowshoes, she stayed atop the drift, light as a phantom, and her feet slid out from the bottom of her skirt. Frenna saw that they were bare, naked and white as the snow beneath them.
I come by daylight to find promising souls, so that he shall surely be satisfied with the night's hunt 2 days hence, and not fly into wrath. All must be prepared.
Frenna squinted in the light that seemed to radiate off of Pectar, and shivered in the bitter cold that accompanied the light. The dagger in her hand grew so cold that it burned her fingers, but she refused to drop the weapon.
And who is he?
Asked Frenna.
The one for whom thee seeks out mortal souls. Can thee not guess? He has many names. I call him simply husband of mine cousin, for so he is. But to mortals he is called Holnir, or Grimnir, or wanton of the hunt. He rides a mount whose hooves do not touch the ground, and his host is terrible to behold. And his face, well, he looks a bit like thy little pole god.
Frenna sucked in a breath, and the frozen air stung in her throat.
And what would this mighty wanton want with me? Oh, nothing, child,
said Pectar, laughing lightly.
Thee is too old. He seeks younger prey, nameless and pure. For only then is there time for him to mold the soul into a proper servant, once the flesh has been consumed. Then thee has no business here today,
Frenna shouted.
Go, spirit, haunt some other woods this Yule and leave us be.
Pectar grinned.
Us, thee say?
Frenna began to back away, feet sliding across the snow. Pectar did not follow, but stood, resolute beside the pole, radiant, smiling, cold as the grave. Frenna just had to get back to the longhouse, back to Aberlin, and then... The cry of a hungry infant rose up in the valley. Frenna's blood froze. She closed her eyes, inhaled, flexed her fingers on the dagger. Should this evil spirit come to investigate the cry, should she even take one step toward the longhouse, Frenna would attack her. She had no other choice. What chance Iron had against the shimmering form of the spirit, Frenna could not guess. Readying herself to strike, she opened her eyes. Pectar was gone, and so was the pole god. Frenna cursed, turned, slipped in the snow and fell. Rising again, she half ran, half skated on her awkward snowshoes back to the longhouse. When she rushed through the door and slammed it behind her, her hands were shaking so badly that she cut her finger on the dagger's blade. "How now, love?" said Aberlin, yawning. He was standing by the bed, cradling the baby in his arms and rocking side to side. "Why does thee have out thy knife? Give him to me, Aberlin, she said, sheathing the dagger and reaching out for her son. Take thee up thy axe and find the bow and arrows. We must flee, and soon as may be, now at once. Peace, Frenna, calm thyself. What has happened? She held the infant to her chest, her cheek against the top of his head. Aberlin, we are not alone. Someone has come into the valley.
Who? Did thee recognise him?
Not a him, not even a someone, really. I think they want our child. They want to take him.
Aberlin stifled another yawn. What are thee saying? I do not understand. Thee saw some sort of spirit then, like the faces in the trees?
Nay, husband, 'twasn't that. This was no essence of life, but a figure of death. A ghost, once human, now in the service of powers most foul. It took the pole god. Why does thee look at me so? Does thee not believe me?
Aberlin exhaled, rubbing his face in his hands.
I doubt not thy conviction, wife, only thy conclusion. Thee was spooked on yesterday's eve by the old hag, and then the wine last night mayhaps has played some trick on thy mind and caused thee to see this apparition. Husband, hear me. We are not safe here.
All right, it's all right. He grabbed his axe off the wall, weighed it in his hands, then hung his arms at his side.
But where are we to go? The path is buried in snow and ice, and we cannot take the boat on the river. We would have to flee on foot, Frenna, and with little hope of reaching the village before sundown. Methinks we are better off here today, if we must fight to protect ourselves. And if thee is right, and we must go, we shall prepare and leave at first light on the morrow.
Frenna sank onto the bed, clutching the infant, beginning to cry.
Dry these tears, wife, said Aberlin. I shall keep thee safe. That is what he said, my father, and he was wise and strong and tall, with 50 spearmen at his side. And he fell, and they took off his head. They took off his head and they put it on a spike, and my mother's beside it, and...
He sat next to her, one hand laid atop her knee.
Frenna, my love, this is different.
She shook her head and tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come.
Frenna, I shall die before I let anything happen to thee or the baby in thy arms.
She swallowed, breathed, and found her voice.
That is what I fear.
When Aberlin had, at last, calmed his wife and guided her to lay on the bed to rest and nurse their child, he took up his axe and bow and went outside. He was gone for nearly an hour, and when he returned, his cheeks were flushed and his eyes looked scared and tired.
Well?
Asked Frenna, sitting up.
The pole god is gone, but there are no footprints near it. But the forest is strange. No birds sing. There is no sound at all, nor any living creature I could find. But I found prints by the westward slope. They look like those of a bear, but bigger, much bigger.
Frenna left her infant sleeping on the bed and rose, helping Aberlin remove his cloak and boots.
When I was young, she told him, I heard stories of great bears in the far north, where the world ends in ice and starlight. They were said to be white as the moon and thrice as tall as any man.
Aberlin shook his head.
I've not heard of such a creature, but my grandmother did speak of an unholy hunt on the 3rd night of Yule, when the Lord of Frenzy led a host of beasts through the mountains. I always thought it was just that, a tale parents tell to frighten children, to keep them inside at night.
Frenna took him by the hand.
Now we are the parents.
He straightened up and nodded.
I shall make all ready for our departure in the morning, and tonight I shall sit awake by the door. Thee shall need sleep as well. Nay, wife, I shall sleep again, when thee is safe. In the end, it was Frenna who could not close her eyes or quiet her mind that night. She lay awake in the stillness, listening to her child's breath, to the wind outside, to the crackling of the log on the hearth, burning lazily, glowing softly red, its embers floating up to escape through the circular hole in the roof above. Abelin sat on the bench before the door, the axe across his lap, but hours passed, and he had hung his head and begun to snore. He did not hear the beast when it approached, but Frenna did. She heard its heavy paws crunching through the snow, circling the house. She heard the deep purr of its breathing and the hollow sound of its nostrils sniffing the air as it came alongside the longhouse. Frenna slipped out from under the blanket and stood silently. She approached the wall and, reaching out, set a hand against the planks. Leaning forward until her forehead touched the wall, she whispered to the night.
"Why does thee bother us so, servant of the gods? Find some other valley, find some other family or village or tribe. Sink thy teeth into half the world, monster, but let us be. I beg thee, let us be."
Outside, the hulking creature sniffed the air. It growled, low and rumbling, and Frenna thought she could make out words within the beastly sound.
"Thou begs in vain. I can smell thy child. My lord shall feast upon his flesh."
Frenna's eyes filled with tears. She brought her other hand up, holding it fast against the wall, as if by doing so she might keep the beast at bay. Her muscles tensed, her fingernails scraping against the wood.
"Go away," she hissed. "Leave us be."
The creature growled.
"When the sun doth set, on morrow's eve, we shall come."
She heard its footfalls in the snow, loud at first, then growing softer and softer as the beast made its way back into the woods. The third day of Yule began without the morning songs of birds or bugs or beasts. The eastern sky glowed bloody red as the sun's first rays appeared. Abelin opened the door and stepped out first, his axe hanging ready on his belt, beside a quiver, one arrow ready on the string of the bow in his hand. Frenna crouched behind him, the baby wrapped beneath her cloak, holding her dagger at her side. The infant was cooing softly, wriggling within the woolen scarf.
"What does thee see?"
Frenna asked.
"Naught but snow on the ground and icicles in the trees. Mayhaps there's nothing to fear after all. Do not lower thy bow, husband. Let us move."
Slowly, they crept forward, pushing through the deep snow, searching the forest with their eyes. They came to the northern edge of the glade, but on the path ahead of them, a great snowbank was piled like a hill between two trees, blocking their way. They moved to the right to find another way out, but as they did so, something flickered in Frenna's vision. Turning, she looked again at the piled snowbank and saw that it had changed. 'Twas not a hill of snow, but one of muscled flesh.
"Husband,"
Frenna whispered, tapping his shoulder while her eyes remained locked on the creature hunched between the trees. Abelin turned, gasped, and rushing to bend his bow, slipped in the snow and fired an arrow into the trees above. Cursing, he fumbled at his quiver for another arrow.
"Do not bother, boy,"
said a mocking voice.
"No chip of flint upon a feathered shaft could hope to pierce the hide of mighty Brutus here."
Panting, Abelin dropped his bow and drew up the axe instead.
"That's her,"
Frenna said to her husband, looking away from the huge white bear and at the shining woman in white, who now stood in the woods ahead of them. Abelin shifted in the snow, trying to get between Frenna and the bear, then Frenna and the woman. The bear gave a hearty grunt, mist issuing from its massive nostrils. Its eyes were small and black, but a wicked light shone in their depths.
We cannot allow ye to leave the valley until the sun sets,
said Perkta.
Ye could turn south and run that way instead, but ye would find the pass there blocked by red-haired Hackle and the horseman. They are, thee could say, less domesticated than Brutus here.
She turned and smiled at the bear, which barked a gravelly laugh.
At day's end, then ye can flee, and the hunt can begin.
Nay,
said Frenna, marching a step forward. Aberlin tried to hold her back, but she shoved away his arm.
Thee shall not take our son, not here, not in the distant woods, nor anywhere. Brave words, girl, but if it is his fate, thee shall not take our son,
she screamed.
I spit on fate, I spit on the gods, I spit on thee, hag of winter. Our son shall live, he shall grow tall and strong. He shall farm in the summer and hunt in the winter. He shall take a wife and see children of his own. That is his fate, so say I. And I,
shouted Aberlin, holding up the axe. Perkta sighed.
Think ye that any other parent says otherwise when the hunt comes for their child? All protest, all in vain. Once the gods have marked a little one for the end finds them. My son has a name,
Frenna declared, throwing open her cloak so that the morning light fell across her baby's face.
Frenna, nay,
gasped Aberlin.
'Tis fortune most foul to name a life so young. What foul fortune could we now have, husband?
Frenna told him. Then she turned to Perkta.
The child's name is Sigwin, after my brother. Sigwin, son of Aberlin. He belongs to his family, and they to him. He is not thine to take.
Annoyance flashed across Perkta's regal face.
That was foolish, but it matters not. He shall take the baby, name or no. Now we simply must kill ye too, as well, so that any memory of Sigwin, son of Aberlin, is erased from the world.
The infant began to struggle, his little fist beating upon Frenna's chest. He was hungry. Aberlin watched the child, his Sigwin, then nodded slowly to himself.
On the morrow,
Aberlin said, hanging his axe back upon his belt.
The first sun of the new year shall rise, and we shall be here to watch it warm the world. But ye,
he pointed, first at Perkta, then at Brutus the bear.
Ye shall have to return behind the veil once more, and bother mortals no more until winter comes again.
Frenna turned back toward the house, pulling down her dress as she did so, and directing little Sigwin to nurse, to drink, to fill his belly with the warm milk of the mother who loved him.
And we shall not run from ye tonight,
Frenna called.
If the hunt wants to find us, they must come to our longhouse. We shall wait for ye there.
Frenna and Aberlin both kept their heads high until they were back inside the house. But as soon as the door was shut behind him, Aberlin collapsed onto the bench, his head in his hands.
What should we do, Frenna?
He whimpered.
I've not the skill nor the weaponry to slay a common black bear, much less a beast like that one. And if a whole host of such horrors attack our home, we cannot hope to...
Frenna took his face in her hands and kissed him.
Peace, husband. But our child, our little Sigwin...
She shook her head.
The price of bringing any child into this world is knowing they shall surely suffer and one day perish. 'Tis the way of things. But what can we do? What parents have always done, our best. But first, I am famished, and it is a feast day. So, we shall sit and eat together. Then we shall wash our boy and lay him down to nap upon the straw. And then we shall lay a bed together, thee and I. That's what we can do. And tonight, whatever comes into this valley, we shall face it together.
Aberlin smiled through his tears.
Do I tell thee I love thee, wife? About 1,000 times a day, aye. 'Tisn't enough.
She leaned down to kiss his forehead.
Thee is enough, Aberlin.
Dusk came all too soon. The light outside, showing through the little slats between the boards, changed from ashen grey to raven black. Frenna swaddled Sigwyn nice and snug, then lay him on the bed, which they had moved into the centre of the room. The table and bench were stacked against the door. Behind them, Aberlin stood, his long hair pulled up into a bun atop his head, his axe resting across one shoulder, his feet apart. In the firelight from the burning log, Frenna thought he looked like the most handsome warrior she had ever seen. Frenna, too, had put up her hair and lashed her dagger to the handle of a broken spade to make a spear. This now leaned against the hearth, the iron blade hovering above the flames, glowing orange. Outside, a howl went up, like a distant pack of hungry wolves. As they listened, more noises joined the squall, the growls of beasts, the blaring of a horn of war, a woman's cackling laugh, branches bending, snapping, falling into the snow, then the cracking of ice.
They come,
said Aberlin.
They are crossing the river now.
He swung the axe off his shoulder and held it before him, massaging the handle in his hands. A rumble issued from the ground beneath their feet. The walls rattled, the tools hanging in the corners clinking together. There were footsteps in the snow outside, the sniffing of animals, the growl of a great bear.
They're in the glade,
whispered Frenna. Her eyes scanned the full windowless walls of the longhouse, searching for the changes in the shadows outside the slats.
They're encircling the house.
Aye, said Aberlin, sliding back one boot, heel turning, tensing into a crouch, ready to strike should any figure burst through the door. Outside, the clamour suddenly died away. Through the stillness came the voice of Perta, the bright one, the seeker of souls.
Hear me now, young ones. The mighty Wantan is coming. His mouth is dry and his belly rumbles. He needs blood and flesh to satisfy his craving. Come ye out, embrace thy destiny. Kneel in the snow, that thee may bow at his arrival, and receive the killing blow by his own hand.
In the quiet that followed her decree, Frenna could hear her own heartbeat. Grabbing up the spear, she marched to stand beside her husband.
We shall not leave this home,
Frenna shouted, shocked by the strength in her voice.
If thee wants us dead, come in thee self, and see our violent resolve with thine own blue eyes, dark one.
They heard the host outside arguing amongst themselves, the dogs snarling, the bear huffing. Then one pair of footsteps approached. Aberlin held up the axe, and Frenna the spear, as they heard someone come to a stop just beyond the door.
Frenna, is that truly thee?
Frenna gasped. It was a man's voice, deep and rich and loving. A voice she knew. A voice she hadn't heard since.
Daughter, 'tis Everhelm, returned to thy side at last. Let me in, let thy father in, that I might look upon thy face again and meet my grandson.
Liar,
shouted Aberlin, and he kicked at the door.
Don't listen to it, Frenna. 'Tis a ruse. 'Tis a deception to nag at thy heart.
There was laughter on the other side, and the voice changed.
It's thou, me grandson, Aberlin? Why's thy leaving old Zimmeria to die out in the cold, Where's thy heart, boy? Open the door. Open the door for old Grandma.
Aberlin clasped his eyes shut. In his hands, the axe was shaking. The voice changed again, rising to a shrieking, impish, drunken laugh.
Hackle dost the voice as well. Hackle is a jester most divine. Is it not so, Mistress Perkta?
That's right, Hackle,
said Perkta's voice.
Thee did very well. Now move aside and eat thy snack of field mice. Let others take their turn upon the door. Brutus?
Something slammed into the door with such force that the bench and table clattered to the floor, and the whole house rumbled. Sigwyn awoke with a cry and began to whimper. Frenna spun and went to him, setting aside the glowing spear.
Hush now,
she said, kissing his forehead.
Listen not to the wicked voices, love. Go back to sleep.
The door shook again, a cloud of dust and snow bursting out from around its frame.
Methinks they can't get in,
whispered Aberlin. He turned to Frenna.
That bear should surely be able to knock down the whole house with one swipe of its paw. But nay, it can't get in, Frenna.
Another crash. Sigwyn started to cry in earnest.
It's only noises,
Aberlin exclaimed.
Meant to scare us, to make us go outside. They can't get in. Is that some magic of thine, wife? A spell of protection in thy blood?
Frenna lifted the swaddled baby into her arms and rocked him back and forth.
I do not know,
she confessed, but she was starting to think he was right. Beyond their walls, the hosts had taken up their furious howling once more, screaming their beastly voices to the night, while on the door beat the heavy paw.
Only noises,
she whispered to the baby and exhaled.
They can't get in here. If we just keep the door shut, then...
Something cold dripped against the back of Frenna's neck. Cradling Sigwyn with one hand, she reached up with the other and felt at her skin. Her fingers came away wet. She held them up in the firelight. There were snowflakes on her fingertips, melting one by one. She craned her neck and looked above her head. Through the smoke hole in the ceiling, a face was looking back at her, long and bony white, with empty eyes and a black hood.
Aberlin,
she screamed, as the figure on the roof twitched and ran an arm down through the ceiling, long and skeletal, with a claw-like hand and reaching fingers. Aberlin ran from the door and leaped, swinging the axe over his head at the arm. The arm twisted and caught the weapon by the handle. Aberlin grunted and swung in the air, clinging to the axe, cursing and trying to wrench the weapon free. Frenna gasped and backed away, her foot tripping on the spear. She fell onto her tailbone, the baby screaming in her arms, as Aberlin lost his grip on the axe and dropped forward onto his hands and face. She heard the crack of a bone. Above them, the creature wriggled its body down through the hole and, grabbing the ceiling boards in its haggard arms, flipped itself down to land, light as a cat, upon their floor. Crouching on bent knees, it looked from the fallen form of Aberlin to Frenna and the child. Frenna clenched Sigwyn tighter, hot tears on her cheeks, her gaze fixed on the firelit monster. Beneath its hood, its exposed skull was that of a horse, jutting nose, square yellow teeth clenched in an unceasing smile, eye sockets empty and black. Whether this was a mask or its true form, Frenna could not tell. With its back hunched, it took a step toward her, reaching out with both arms.
Nay!
Frenna screamed, twisting her body to shield the infant. Bony fingers pawed up her legs, at her stomach, at her back. She kicked at the creature, jabbed with her elbow, headbutt its arms as it crawled on top of her. Its cloak fell about her eyes, blinding her. In the darkness, she felt Sigwyn wriggling against her chest. She tried to tighten her grip on the baby, but the bony fingers fixed around her forearms, squeezing like iron nails into her flesh, and pried her arms apart.
Sigwyn!
Frenna screamed, as the creature snatched the baby and leaped backward, hiding the tiny, swaddled body under its cloak. It straightened up, the frozen grin in the horse skull flickering wildly in the firelight. Then Aberlin appeared behind it, axe in hand. He screamed as he brought the axe down hard into the creature's back. The creature spasmed, stumbling forward, and Frenna saw a flash of Sigwyn in its grip, One pudgy little arm loose from the swaddling cloth and bouncing as the infant swung in the air. Frenna scrambled to her feet, reaching for the spear on the floor, but the creature bent its knees and jumped straight up, grabbing the ceiling with one hand. The axe remained lodged in its back, and Aberlin still clung to the handle, blood running down his face, screaming through clenched teeth as his legs kicked empty air. The creature bent its outstretched arm, drawing itself and Aberlin up toward the smoke hole above and the roof beyond.
Nay!
Screamed Frenna as the creature clambered higher, tearing at the ceiling, snapping boards, raining splinters and clumps of snow into the house below. It was halfway onto the roof now. Sigwyn was out of sight. Aberlin lost his grip on the axe and for a moment seemed to hover in the air. Then his hands grabbed at the edge of the hole. He clung, legs swinging, as the creature dragged itself fully outside. Frenna heard its footfalls across the roof and the barking cheers from the hunters in the glade.
Aberlin!
She moaned. Gritting his teeth and kicking his legs, Aberlin pulled himself up, his head and shoulders disappearing from view.
Bring him back!
Frenna screamed.
Thee must get our child and bring him back!
She watched, her mind reeling, her whole body numb, as her husband pulled his legs up through the hole and rolled out onto the roof. She heard his boots stomping overhead, his voice grunting curses, the laughter of the beastly hunters. Spinning in place, Frenna looked at the mess of broken wood and bloody snow on the floor and spotted the spear. The dagger at its tip still smoked and glimmered with a dull orange light. Grabbing the spear, she marched to the door, wrenched out the plank that locked it shut, and opened it. A wave of icy air and windswept snow crashed over Frenna as she stepped outside, spear held out before her. The glade was filled with beastly shapes, with smiling eyes, with cackling voices. Frenna looked up and saw the great white bear, with Perkta now seated atop its shoulders, shining brightly in the night. By the hulking feet of Brutus, a herd of famished wolves cowered and snarled, with bared teeth and fiery red eyes. Behind the wolves, on saddles made to fit their small bodies, sat dark imps with tiny arms and tiny horns, like wicked little spirits. The figure of a gaunt old man with tangled red hair danced in the snow to her left, giggling and babbling as he kicked and spun, waving his arms and sticking out his tongue.
The door is opened.
He sang in the high voice of a child.
The meat is weeping.
He cried out, cackling like an old hag. Frenna looked around desperately for any sign of Aberlin or Sigwyn. There were creatures everywhere. In the snow, in the trees, on the roof. An orgy of shadows and sounds. Then she saw that among the crowd at the side of the house, the beasts had backed away to form a circle, and in its centre, two figures moved in deadly combat.
Aberlin!
She tried to run, but the snow was up to her knees and slowed her down. In her hands, the daggered spear tip was cooling in the night air, silver and smoking. Around her, the creatures abruptly quieted, and turning as one, looked north, hideous faces turning skyward. Frenna looked north with them and froze in place. The winter sky was split in two by a dazzling river of aurora, shimmering with every colour, like a twisted ribbon of rainbow in the night. Upon this vibrant road, and coming fast, there galloped a vast and haunted horse, 8-legged like spider, with eyes like burning coals, and on its back there rode an old man with an antler helm and a flowing beard that streamed behind him in the wind. In his hand he held a mighty hammer. In but a moment, the figure of the horse and its godly rider had grown to fill half the sky. Frenna turned from the accursed sight and, pushing forward through the snow, reached the circle of excited hunters. Shoving between them, She emerged in the ring and saw Abelin with the axe again in his hands, dripping blood onto the snow, eyes fixed on the ghastly horseman, whose cloak was torn to shreds, revealing a scarred hunchback and a cadaverous body. In the creature's arms, she saw her Sigwin, alive or dead, she did not know. Frenna raised her spear and launched herself forward at the creature, driving the weapon up into its skeletal face, the dagger sinking into the right eye socket with a squelching thud. The creature seized and fell to its knees, holding out the baby in one outstretched arm. Abelin swung his axe and severed its arm at the elbow. Frenna gasped as Sigwin fell from the claw-like fingers, but Abelin threw down his axe and caught the infant just before it hit the ground. Jumping to his feet, Abelin ran, clutching the baby to his chest with one arm as his free hand snagged Frenna by the shoulder and pulled her into the run with him. As they smashed through the circle of hunters and dashed around the front of the longhouse, the rainbow glow of the aurora was blotted out by the towering silhouette of the bearded god. They reached the front door. Frenna jumped inside, spinning round as Abelin came in behind her, sliding to a stop and handing her the baby while trying to shut the door. She held Sigwin to her chest, feeling at his little body. He was warm, and he was crying, softly but surely.
"Hold fast the door!"
shouted Abelin. Frenna looked up. Hands and snouts were poking in from around the doorframe, shoving it inward. Frenna drove her shoulder into the door, and holding Sigwin in her arms, slammed her back against it. The hunters pushed back, rattling the door, the walls and the house. She closed her eyes, held her breath, and pushed. Abelin started to scream, not a cry of pain, but of battle. Opening her eyes, she saw him marching over from the hearse, holding in his arms the great burning log. Flames licked up his sleeves to his shoulders, but he walked on, eyes alight, and reaching for the door, swung the fiery weapon at the clawed hands and wolfish head sticking around the doorframe. The hunters cried out in fear and scurried backward. Frenna felt the door against her back shut. She had no time to catch her breath, for she saw more hands reaching from the broken ceiling and screamed to Abelin. He saw them, hurried to the wall closest to the hole, and scraped the burning log along the boards, setting the wall aflame. Fire licked up the wooden planks, blazing bright and filling the room with smoke. Frenna stumbled forward, swooning, coughing, Sigwin crying in her arms. Abelin threw down the burning log into the far corner and turned, his tunic still on fire.
"Come to us,"
Frenna panted. Beating at the flames on both arms, he lumbered forward. His hair was singed, his face bloody, his eyes unfocused, but he made it to the bed, and grabbing up the blanket where it had fallen, he swung it up and over them, draping the family in a little tent. Beneath the blanket, Frenna found her husband's face in the darkness and kissed him.
"I know I love thee,"
she whispered, as the house around them burned. Wood crackling, snow melting and hissing on the roof, beastly voices howling outside. Between wife and husband, Sigwin stopped his crying, and curling up against his mother's chest, he pressed his cheek into her skin.
"I know I love thee,"
repeated Frenna.
"I know I love thee. I know I love thee." "Frenna," she heard Abelin say, "listen, does thee hear?"
He threw the blanket suddenly off of them, and blazing fire blinded Frenna on the bed. She cried out and reached for the blanket, but Abelin seized her hand and pulled her to her feet. Running through the crumbling, fiery wreckage of the longhouse, he led them through the flaming door and out into the frigid glade beyond. Frenna fell to her knees in the snow, Sigwin wriggling in her arms. She looked around. Where were the hunters? Where were the gods?
The sun!
Abelin shouted, lifting his smoking arms to the east.
The sun is rising!
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to click subscribe and check out some more stories here.